The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was a place that made most beings feel small. The walls were tall and curved, made from deep blue crystal that caught the light and threw it in long, pale lines across the floor. The air inside was cool and still. The seats rose high in wide circles around a central platform, and on that platform 43 species sat in rows behind their delegation tables, their voices translated by the small devices clipped near their mouths. It had been this way for 4,000 years. The same chamber, the same rules, the same balance. Wu-Tai sat at the human delegation table and watched the room with calm eyes. He had been doing this for 11 years. He knew this chamber the way a man knows a house he has lived in for a long time. Every creak, every cold draft, every dark corner. He knew which delegates smiled at humans in the open and whispered against them in the back halls. He knew which species feared humanity, not because humans had done anything wrong, but because humans were growing fast, and growing fast made the old powers nervous. He was a tall man, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have learned that speaking too much gives others too much to work with. His hair was short and dark, cut clean. His suit was plain. He carried no weapons. None of the human delegates did. The council hall was a place of law, not war. At the top of the chamber, seated on the high curved bench, was High Chancellor Veeth Ka. His species was old, reptilian, slow-moving, with flat black eyes that missed nothing. He had ruled the council for 60 years and had never once lost a vote he truly wanted to win. Beside him, leaning close and speaking in low tones, was Warlord Orentel. He was insectoid, tall, angular, with 6 thin arms that he kept folded tight against his body when he was thinking. He had spent the last 2 years building a case in the back rooms of this hall. He had spoken to delegates in private. He had shared reports, projections, and numbers. He had been patient and careful, the way a person is when they are planning something that cannot be undone. The case was simple. Humanity was a problem, not yet a danger, but moving in that direction. Their colonies now sat at the edges of 4 of the most important trade routes in the known galaxy. Their fleet drills were long and complex and involved weapons tests that made the Council's own admirals uneasy. Their ships were being built at a pace that no new species had ever matched. In 50 years, Oruntel had argued they would be untouchable. The time to act was now, while the window was still open. Most delegates had listened. Some had agreed. A few had refused. Pelisu was one of the ones who refused. She was avian with soft gray feathers and wide amber eyes, and she sat at her delegation table with her wings folded flat and her jaw tight. She had heard Orentel's case 3 times in private sessions and had rejected it each time. Humanity had done nothing to justify what was being proposed. Expanding fast was not a crime. Building ships was not a crime. Being new and strong was not a crime. She had said all of this. No one had listened. The vote was called at the 9th hour of the session. Veeth Ka read the resolution aloud in a flat, steady voice. All human diplomatic personnel were to be detained immediately. Human colony worlds along the border were to be struck by Council forces as a show of authority. The human species was to be made to understand that the Council's word was final, and its power was absolute. Pelisu stood and spoke against it. 2 other delegates stood with her. They spoke clearly, and they spoke well, and it made no difference at all. The vote passed. 31 for, 12 against. The chamber doors sealed before Wu-Tai fully understood what had happened. He heard the locks slide into place, a sound like stone settling, and then he heard boots on the floor. Council security forces moved in from every side entrance. 6 species, 40 guards. They were already in position. They had been waiting. He looked around the table. The 8 other members of the human delegation were looking at him. Some had gone pale. One younger aide had her hand pressed flat against the table, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Wu-Tai looked at each of them for a moment, then turned his gaze up toward the high bench where Veeth Ka sat watching. He did not shout. He did not beg. He did not reach for anything, because there was nothing to reach for. He said only one thing, his voice clear and even across the quiet chamber. "You have no idea what you just did." The guards took him and the other 8 into custody without resistance. The human delegates did not fight. There was no point in fighting 40 guards in a sealed room with their hands empty. so they walked where they were told to walk, and they were taken out of the chamber and into a holding area beneath the building, and the chamber doors opened again, and the session continued as if they had never been there at all. What came next was not something Wu-Tei could stop. The council had planned it carefully. The executions were broadcast live on the Galactic Network, a public message to every species watching, and most importantly, to Earth. 9 humans. 9 people who had come to the council hall in formal clothes with no weapons, the way the law required, gone in front of the whole galaxy. Pelisue watched from her seat and did not move. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were still. She memorized every face. She would not forget them. The signal carrying the broadcast left Veth Prime at the speed of light, folded through the relay stations, and moved across the dark between stars in the direction of a small blue planet near the edge of council-mapped space. It would take 6 hours to arrive. In those 6 hours, the council celebrated. They called it a success. They called it order restored. Orun Tel moved through the reception hall afterward with his arms unfolded for the first time in weeks, relaxed and pleased. No one in that hall, not Vethka, not Orun Tel, not a single one of the 31 who had voted yes, stopped to ask one simple question. What happens next? The signal arrived at Earth at 3:14 in the morning, local time at the New Sol Strategic Command Bunker. It came through the relay network quietly, the way bad news often does, without warning, without drama. Just a data packet that hit the receivers and began playing on every screen in the building at once. The people in that bunker watched it in silence. When it ended, no one spoke for 12 minutes. Not the communications officers, not the analysts sitting at their stations with their coffee going cold, not the military advisors who had spent their careers preparing for scenarios that were never supposed to actually happen. They all just sat there in the blue-gray light of the screens, looking at the faces of 9 people they had known. Narajia sat at the head of the war room table. She was a small woman with short hair and a face that gave very little away, even on a good day. She had been prime minister for 4 years, and before that, she had spent 20 years in government service, learning how to stay steady when everything around her was not. She watched the broadcast until the end. Then she sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes forward, and she did not move. After the 12 minutes, she spoke. Her voice was low and even. "How long until our border colonies are hit?" Kang Bin answered from across the table. He was her chief intelligence officer, a lean man with sharp eyes behind plain glasses, the kind of person who always seemed to already know the answer before he was asked. 30 hours, he said. 40 at most. They staged the fleet before the vote. They planned this ahead of time. And Inha Sora. Already moving. She repositioned the Third Armada the moment the signal came in. She didn't wait for orders. Narajia nodded slowly. She wouldn't. She stood up and looked at the room, at every face turned toward her, and she began to give orders. Not loud orders, not dramatic ones, just clear and steady and one after another, the way you build a wall, one brick at a time. What the council did not know, what they had not bothered to find out, because they had decided the answer before they asked the question, was the true shape of humanity's military. They had looked at the ships humanity registered with the Council Fleet Registry, and they had run their projections from those numbers. They had seen a young species with a growing but manageable force. They had seen something they could handle. They had not seen everything. Kang Bin pulled up the real numbers in the war room, and he walked the assembled generals and ministers through them, one by one. 17 active armadas, 6 of which were already repositioning without waiting for formal deployment orders because their commanders had watched the same broadcast and reached the same conclusion. A network of listening posts and sensor arrays spread across every approach to human space, most of them invisible to council detection because they had been built to look like debris and rock and dead satellites. And then there was the thing that even most people in that room did not fully know about. Project Shepherd. It had started 17 years ago as a classified program under a different name. The idea was simple and came from a very old human instinct, the understanding that peace does not always last, and that trusting a new alliance completely before it has been tested is the kind of mistake that only gets made once. So while the registered fleet grew at a pace the council could watch and measure and feel comfortable with, a second fleet had been built in the dark. in the hollowed-out cores of asteroids, in deep space stations that did not appear on any council chart, ships that ran cold and quiet, not broadcasting, not moving, just waiting. 61 vessels, not the largest fleet humanity had, but not a small one either. Kang Bin finished the briefing and the room was very quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet from the 12 minutes after the broadcast. That quiet had been grief. This one was something else. Meanwhile, in the outer reaches of the Kepler system, Sergeant Major Ho Ray was not in a war room. He was standing on the loading deck of a military transport ship with his unit around him, watching the same broadcast on a small screen someone had propped against a fuel canister. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been through a few things and remembered all of them. He had been a soldier for 19 years. He had fought in 2 colonial disputes and 1 enforcement action, and he had come home from all of them, which was more than some people could say. He watched the broadcast until the end. Then he turned it off and looked at his squad. 12 people, some young, some not, all of them watching him. He picked up his gear. "Strap in," he said. "We're not waiting for a memo." Nobody argued. They knew what he meant. The Kepler 7 colony defense grid was 20 minutes away, and if the Council fleet was 30 hours out, then 30 hours was what they had. He intended to use every one of them. Back on Earth, Narajia had been in continuous meetings for 6 hours when the first formal Council communication arrived. It was addressed to the office of the Prime Minister, and it used very careful language. It described the executions as a necessary measure. It described the upcoming strikes on border colonies as a proportional demonstration of authority. It invited Earth to respond through official diplomatic channels. She read it once. She set it down. She did not respond to it. Kang Bin raised an eyebrow. "Let them wait," she said. "Let them spend those 30 hours thinking they are in control of this." She walked to the window of the bunker's upper level. Outside it was still dark, and the city was quiet, and the stars were out. She looked up at them for a long moment, at all that dark between here and there, between the people she had lost and the people who had taken them. Then she turned back to the room. "Get me Inha Sora." In the dark of deep space, 61 cold ships began to move. Grand Admiral Drax Mole had done this before, not to humans, but to others. He had led pacification fleets twice in his career, once against a species that had broken trade law, and once against a colony world that had declared independence from its parent government. Both times it had been clean work. You arrive in force, you make your presence known, you fire on a target that cannot fire back in any meaningful way, and the message is sent. The whole operation usually lasted a day, sometimes less. He expected the same here. His fleet came out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Kepler 7 system with 40 ships in tight formation. They were good ships, council-built, well-armed, crewed by species with centuries of spacefaring experience. He stood on the command deck of his flagship and looked at the display screen showing the planet ahead, a human colony world. Population, about 120,000. Registered defense assets, light. Nothing that would trouble a fleet this size. He gave the order to move in. The first thing that happened was nothing. That was normal. Civilian worlds went quiet when a fleet approached. People hid. Systems powered down. He had seen it many times. Then the asteroids moved. It started at the edge of the display, a slow, subtle shift in the debris field that circled the outer planet. One rock changing course, then another, then 6 at once, then all of them. And they were not rocks. The heat signatures bloomed on his screens as engines came to life inside hulls that had been built to look exactly like stone and ice and dead metal. 61 ships running cold for months, waiting right here in the exact corridor the Council fleet would have to pass through to reach the colony. The bridge of Drax Mole's flagship went completely silent. A voice came through on the open channel. It was calm, almost gentle. "Grand Admiral, you have fired on a human world and executed our ambassadors. I'm giving you exactly one opportunity to stand down and return to Council space. This offer expires in 60 seconds. Inha Sora was not on one of the hidden ships. She was on the lead vessel of the Third Armada, coming in fast from the other side of the system. She had been a fleet commander for 12 years. She was not a loud person, and she was not a person who enjoyed war, but she was very good at it. The way some people are very good at things they wish they did not have to be good at. 60 seconds passed. Drax Maul refused the offer. He told himself it was because backing down in front of 40 ship captains and the Council's entire broadcast network would be politically impossible. That was true, but it was also true that he did not believe 61 ships, even 61 surprise ships, were enough to stop what he had brought. He was wrong in ways that would take him a long time to understand. The battle began, and it did not go the way any of his models had predicted. Human fleet doctrine was not what the Council's analysts had told him to expect. They had prepared him for something slow and positional, based on the recorded conflicts from humanity's own history. Big ships holding lines, trading fire from distance, managing resources carefully. What he got was nothing like that. Human ships moved in small clusters that split apart and came back together with no apparent plan. And then he would realize too late that there had been a plan the whole time, and he had just driven his ships into the middle of it. Captains made decisions without waiting for orders from the command ship. They changed direction mid-engagement without signaling. 3 of his ships were destroyed before he even understood what formation they were being hit from. And then the boarding party started. That was the thing that shook his crew more than any weapon. Human soldiers in armored suits came across the gaps between ships in mag-sealed pods and hit the hulls and cut through and came inside. It was considered a near-suicidal tactic. The old data said boarding actions had a failure rate of over 80% against a defended ship, but the data was old, and the humans had spent a long time thinking about how to do it better. Ho-Ray went in through the port cargo hatch of a council cruiser with 11 people behind him. The ship had a crew of 300. It had internal security, defensive barriers, and weapons systems that were supposed to make exactly this kind of action impossible. He and his squad took the ship in 40 minutes. He did it the way he did everything, not fast or reckless, but steady. Moving through each section, making decisions in real time, not stopping when it was hard, not pausing when people on his side got hurt. He had been doing hard things for 19 years, and he had learned that the main difference between things that succeeded and things that failed was usually just whether the people doing them kept going when they wanted to stop. They kept going. Across the battle, the pattern repeated itself. Council ships found they could not predict where the threat was coming from. They could not fall back to a defensive line because the human fleet did not let them form one. 3 council vessels tried to break away from the engagement and run. 2 were caught, 1 made it out and jumped away, and Inha Sora let it go on purpose. She wanted someone to carry the news home. When it was over, Drax Maul sat on his damaged flagship with 9 ships remaining from the 40 he had brought. His command deck had a hole in the outer wall that had been sealed with emergency foam. 2 of his senior officers were in the medical bay. He looked at the display showing the debris of his fleet scattered across the outer orbit of a colony world that was still, as far as he could tell, fully intact and fully operational. He opened a channel back to Veth Prime. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and empty, the way a voice gets when a person is in shock but is trying very hard not to show it. "We have made a terrible mistake." On the colony below, the people of Kepler 7 came out from the shelters and looked up at the sky. It was clear now. The light from distant engines was fading. Someone on the main communication channel said that the fleet was gone, and there was a long pause. And then, all across the colony, in the shelters, in the tunnels, in the defense stations, people let out a breath they had been holding for 30 hours. In space above them, Inha Sora looked at the numbers on her screen. Her losses were not 0. They were real, and they hurt, and she would carry them. But the colony was standing, the people were alive, and the council fleet that had come to make an example of humanity was now a field of wreckage, drifting slowly outward toward the dark. She wrote her report. She kept it short. There were more systems to reach, and not much time to sit still. The Grand Chamber had a very different feeling now. 3 days ago, it had been a place of confidence. The vote had passed cleanly, and the delegates who had supported it had walked out into the reception hall afterward with the relaxed posture of people who had done something difficult and done it well. They had talked about order, about necessary action, about the long future of galactic stability that this decision would protect. Now those same delegates sat in their seats and looked at the reports coming in and said very little. Drax Maul's message had arrived first, and then the full battle record from Kepler-7 pulled from the surviving ship's logs, then the reports from the 2 other border engagements that had gone the same way. Council forces arriving expecting minimal resistance and finding something that was not minimal at all. 3 engagements, 3 results that looked almost identical. The Council fleet losing badly, the human fleet not retreating, not holding a defensive line, but pushing forward into Council-mapped space like they had been waiting for a reason. Veth-Ka sat at the top of the chamber and watched the reports come in and kept his expression still. He was old, and he was very practiced at keeping his expression still, but the people who knew him well could see it in the way he held his hands, flat and tight against the bench in front of him, the way you hold on to something when the ground starts moving. Orentel was not still. He paced the side corridor outside the chamber between sessions, his 6 arms folding and unfolding, his voice quick and sharp when he spoke to anyone who came near him. He wanted a counteroffensive. He had numbers, he said. He had ships that had not been deployed yet. The Council's full military force, properly organized and sent in together, could still turn this around. Nobody was listening to him the way they had before. Pela-Su sat in her seat and watched it all and did not say anything for a long time. She had said her piece before the vote. She had stood up in this chamber and argued against it clearly and correctly and been overruled. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came with being right in a way that could not help anyone, and she felt it now, heavy and quiet in her chest. She waited for the right moment. It came on the second day. It's when Veth-Ka called for an emergency session to discuss a ceasefire broadcast. The chamber was louder than usual, delegates talking across each other, some demanding action, some demanding negotiation, some just demanding that someone else make a decision so they would not have to. Pela-Su let them talk for a while, then she stood up and waited until the room noticed her and went quiet. "We voted to execute people who had come to this hall in peace," she said. "We called it order. We called it stability. We called it necessary. And now we want to send a ceasefire broadcast as if the word of this council still means something reliable." She paused. "If we want to end this, we do not broadcast. We submit, and we submit in full." The room did not like that. Several delegates spoke against her loudly, but the reports kept coming in, and each one made her words a little harder to argue with. On Earth, Kang Bin laid a stack of intercepted communications on Narajia's desk without comment. She picked up the first one and read it, then the second, then the rest. They were private back-channel messages from 6 council member species sent directly to Earth's government contact addresses in careful, formal language. Each one said, in its own way, the same thing, that the sending species had not fully supported the resolution, that they wished to maintain positive relations with humanity, and that they hoped the current situation could be resolved without further conflict. 6 species. All of them had voted yes. Narajia set the last message down and looked at the wall for a moment. "They're scared," Kang Bin said. "Yes," she said. "Now, let's make sure it counts for something." Earth's response to the Council's ceasefire broadcast was not a negotiation. It was a document. 5 pages, plain language, no room for interpretation. Narajia had written most of it herself, working through the night with her senior advisors. It listed what was required: full public acknowledgement of the executions as a crime against sentient life, the resignation and extradition of those who had designed and driven the resolution, starting with Orentel, to stand trial under human law, a full renegotiation of humanity's status in any future galactic governance body, not as provisional members, but as full equals. Reparations to the families of the 9 dead, and to every colony world that had been struck. The Council's combined fleet stood down and returned to home systems within 96 hours. The document was transmitted to every council member simultaneously, not just to Veth-Ka's office. Every delegate received it at the same moment. Every species in the galaxy with access to council network feeds could see it had been sent. There was no version of receiving it that was private or quiet. In the corridor outside the chamber, Orentel read it on his personal device and felt something shift in his chest, a cold dropping feeling that he had not felt in a very long time. He closed the document. He looked at the corridor around him. The other delegates and aides and officials moving through the hall were not looking at him the way they had 3 days ago. The ones that met his eyes looked away quickly. The ones that didn't see him first changed direction before they got close. He made a decision. He went to his private office. He contacted his personal transport pilot. He moved quickly and quietly, the way he always moved when he was doing something he did not want anyone to see. By the time anyone noticed he had left the building, he was already aboard his vessel, and the vessel was already moving away from Veth Prime at speed. He had a destination, a neutral station 2 systems away, where he had kept resources and contacts for situations that required a fast exit. He had prepared for something like this. Not this exactly, but something. He never arrived. There was a human ship waiting in the shadow of the system's outer gas giant. It had been there for 22 hours, running cold, watching. When Orentel's transport made its jump and came out on the other side, the human ship was already in position. The transport's pilot tried to maneuver. There was no useful direction to maneuver to. Ho-Ray came through the transport's side hatch with 4 members of his squad and found Orentel in the rear cabin, standing very still against the far wall with his arms folded tight. Ho-Ray looked at him for a moment. "You're wanted," he said simply. "Come quietly." For a long few seconds, Orentel did not move. Then he unfolded one arm and made a small gesture, the sign of compliance in his species language. His shoulders dropped. Something went out of him, some tension that had been holding him together, and without it, he just looked old and tired and much smaller than he had looked 3 days ago in the council hall. Ho-Ray stepped back to let him walk to the front of the ship. Back on Veth Prime, in the Grand Chamber, Veth Ka received word of the capture and sat with it for a long time. Around him the chamber continued. Voices, arguments, fear dressed up as strategy. He did not join in. He read Earth's 5-page document again, slowly from the beginning. When he finished it the second time, he put it down and looked at the chamber ceiling, at the blue crystal and the pale lines of light that had been there for 4,000 years. And he understood something that he should have understood before the vote. Humanity had not come to the galaxy looking for a fight. They had come the way every species came, carefully, hopefully, trying to find a place in a structure that already existed and already had its rules. And the council had taken that careful, hopeful people and killed 9 of them in front of the whole galaxy. What followed was not aggression. It was not conquest. It was the oldest, simplest thing in the universe. It was an answer. The war lasted 4 months. It did not end the way wars usually end. There was no final battle where one side collapsed and the other stood over them. There was no single moment of surrender on a flagship or in a grand hall. What happened instead was slower and, in many ways, more complete. The Council's military coalition began to fall apart from the inside. Species that had voted yes started pulling their ships back home. Private communications between Earth and individual council members, the kind Kang Bin had been intercepting from the start, became public ones, with delegations formally announcing they were stepping back from the conflict. The unified front that Orentel had built so carefully over 2 years came apart in 2 months because it had never been built on something solid. It had been built on fear of what humanity might become. And that fear, it turned out, was not enough to hold 31 species together when the thing they feared turned out to be exactly as capable as they had worried. By the time Veth Ka formally acknowledged that the Council could not continue the conflict, 6 of the member species had already sent their own delegations to the neutral ground of Station Mirova to begin separate talks with Earth. He was not leading the peace process. He was following it. The way a person follows a river because the current is already moving and there is no useful point in fighting it. Station Mirova was a trading post at the intersection of 3 major routes. Old, functional, and owned by a small species that had no stake in the conflict, and a long history of hosting talks between people who needed a place to talk. It smelled like recycled air and machine oil and the food of 15 different species. And its corridors were narrow, and its meeting rooms were plain. And it was, Narajia thought when she arrived, exactly the right place for this. She came with a small delegation, 12 people. No military escort inside the station, though the 3rd Armada was parked close enough that everyone knew it was there. She did not come in the way a conqueror comes, loud, surrounded by symbols of power, making everyone wait for her. She came quietly, and she shook the hands of the delegates who offered them, and nodded to the ones whose species did not shake hands, and she sat down at the table and got to work. The talks lasted 6 weeks. Narajia said the same thing at the beginning of every session to every delegation, in plain language with no ceremony around it. We do not want your planets. We do not want control of your governments, or your trade, or your people. We want a structure that makes sure this never happens again, to us, or to anyone. She meant it. And after the first week, most of the delegates around the table believed she meant it, because the terms Earth proposed matched the words. Humanity was not asking for territory. They were not asking for tribute. They were asking to tear down the system that had allowed the vote to happen and build something with better bones. The old council structure was dissolved. It was not a violent dismantling. It was a formal, documented process, each piece of it agreed upon by the member species. The veto system that had allowed a handful of powerful species to override the rest was gone. The closed sessions where deals were made before votes were called were gone. The new body, called the Mirova Accord after the station where it was born, had a multi-chamber structure with seats distributed in a way that made it much harder for any one species or alliance of species to simply outvote everyone else into silence. Humanity's seat in this new structure was not provisional, it was not conditional, it was foundational, written into the base document as one of the founding members, not as a species that had been admitted reluctantly and could be removed if they became inconvenient. Pelesu signed the accord on the third day of the final session. She was the first non-human to do so. She had come to Mirova without being asked, had requested a seat at the table without going through the formal channels, and had arrived 2 days early and spent those 2 days reading every page of the draft document. When the signing session came, she walked to the table and signed without making a speech. She did not feel that a speech was needed. She had said what she had to say before the vote on Veth Prime, and no one had listened, and here they were. The document said what needed to be said now. After the session, Narajia found her in the corridor outside. I voted against it, Pelesu said. They had spoken by channel before, but this was the first time they had been in the same room. Pelesu was taller than Narajia by about half a meter, with gray feathers and amber eyes that were very direct. I said it in the chamber and I was overruled. I want you to know that. I know, Narajia said. We know. There was a short silence. For whatever it is worth, Pelesu said. It's worth something, Narajia said. We'll remember. They stood there for a moment in the narrow corridor with the smell of recycled air around them and the sound of distant voices from the next meeting room, and then they shook hands. And that was the beginning of something that would matter in the years that came after. Orentel's trial was held on Earth 6 months after the accord was signed. It was public. Every session was broadcast on the Galactic Network, not as revenge theater, not to humiliate anyone, but as a record, a precedent. The argument Narajia had made to the other Accord members when some of them questioned whether a public trial was wise was simple. If we do this quietly, in a room no one can see, then in 100 years, someone will say it did not happen, or that it was not serious, or that the rules do not apply to powerful people. We do it in the open so the record is clear. Every species, every government, every person watching can see what the charge is, and what the evidence is, and what the outcome is. That is how you make something mean something. Orentel was convicted. The sentence was not death. It was permanent removal from any position of public authority in any governing body recognized by the Accord, and confinement under Accord supervision for the remainder of his life. Some people on Earth thought it was not enough. Narajia understood why they felt that way. She had felt it herself, in the long nights in the war room, in the moments when she let herself think about Wute and the others. But the point of the Accord was to build something better, and you did not build something better by letting grief write the rules. Inha Sora accepted her promotion to Supreme Commander of the UEF with one condition that she stated clearly and would not negotiate on. The fleet would be reduced proportionally as Accord member species demonstrated good faith over time. The whole point, she said, of what they had done, the whole reason it had cost what it cost, was to prove that humanity was not trying to dominate anything. The best way to prove that was to say it and then do it. Ho Rei retired on a Tuesday. He was offered a medal at a ceremony in New Seoul, and he declined it politely, which caused some confusion because he was the most decorated enlisted soldier of the conflict, and declining the medal meant the ceremony had no main event, and everyone had to stand around eating food and talking about what to do next. He did not mind causing that confusion. He went home and slept for 11 hours, and then spent the next several weeks doing very little, which was the first time in 19 years he had done very little, and he found he was better at it than he expected. When a journalist found him 2 months later and asked him how he felt about everything, he thought about it for a moment. "We were just doing what anyone would do," he said, "when someone kills your people." He did not add anything to that. He did not feel it needed anything added. The memorial was built on the grounds of the Accord's new headquarters, a low, wide building on a hillside with a view of open sky. 9 names were cut into a flat stone in letters deep enough that rain could not wear them smooth. Below the names, a single line. The Accord's translation committee had spent 3 days making sure it said the same thing in every member language, with no word changed and no meaning softened. They came in peace. What followed was our answer. People came to see it from many places and many species in the years after. They stood in front of it for different lengths of time and for different reasons. Some came because they wanted to understand what had happened. Some came because they had voted yes and needed to stand somewhere that made them face what that meant. Some came because they had people they had lost and needed a place to put that. Pelosu came on the first anniversary and stood there for a long time without speaking. The sky above the Accord building was the particular shade of pale blue it got in the late afternoon, and the wind was moving through the grass on the hillside, and it was quiet. She memorized the names again. She had already memorized them the day they were cut, looking at the footage on her screen on Veth Prime, but she memorized them again here, standing in front of the stone, because some things deserve to be held on to more than once. Across 43 star systems, the galaxy kept moving. Ships traveled. People traded. Species who had been on opposite sides of a vote learned slowly and imperfectly how to work together in the new structure. It was not easy. It was not clean. But it was different from what it had been, and the difference had cost enough that most people were willing to work to keep it. Humanity did not fight to be feared, but when the moment had come, they had made very sure that the lesson was one nobody would forget. That, in the end, was enough.